Good afternoon, and welcome everyone. I'm Robert Solomon. I serve as the Vice President for the Office for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity. We are so excited to have you all here with us for another one of our Power of Diversity lecture series. And we are delighted to be featuring Dr. Angela Clark-Taylor today. And we anticipate that she's going to have a number of exciting things to share with us to make it challenging us, help us to think more critically. And I will state right away that I have to be in two places at once. So halfway through, I'm gonna pop out over to a CIA event. That's the Center for International Affairs in another building here on campus. So I do want to extend my apologies, but we will be in the able hands of Kimberly Springer. Wave your hand there. Kimberly, who is our diversity program manager, who will continue through our process and lead the Q&A. So make sure you have questions to ask, and she'll tell you what to do at the appropriate time. But I did want to just take just a few moments. Of course, Dr. Taylor doesn't want me to talk too much, but she is our executive director in the Division of Student Affairs for the Flora Stone Mather Center for Women on our campus. She's been doing an outstanding job for us, and she and I came in around the same time, 2.5 years or so ago, and it's just been a delight to have her as a campus partner. Dr. Taylor is a scholar practitioner with 15 years experience in community agencies and higher education. And as I mentioned, she serves as our executive director for the Flora Stone Mather Center for Women here at Case, but she previously served as director for the Center for Women and Gender Equity and the founding director for the Violence Prevention Center at Bowling Green State University. She's an assistant professor in higher education and counseling at the University at the Redlands, where she served there, and program manager for the Susan B. Anthony Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Rochester. She is a practitioner, she is a scholar, and she is a dear friend. So please warmly welcome Dr. Angela Clark-Taylor.
I feel short. Hello, everybody. I have to be honest, this is off the cuff. One of the first things I did when I arrived here on campus was saw a Power of Diversity lecture, and I've always really wanted to do one, so I hope I do it justice today. I'm particularly excited to share with you today some preliminary data and emerging findings from a research project that explores the career experiences and progression of non-instructional women staff in higher education. Through this survey, I looked at all of the most common things we think about women in higher education and leadership that often is not studied on women staff in higher education. And so this included a questionnaire on educational and professional background, such as promotion, degree attainment, career status, combined with validated scales on career satisfaction, career decision-making, work-life balance, imposter syndrome, and campus climate. All buzzwords I'm sure you have all heard before about your career and others. And so though I am talking about a study today, right, I want really this to be a discussion. Our agenda over the next hour begins with a brief background of the Mather Center and the Well, followed by an overview of the project, some implications, and really a discussion about how we might create a more supportive environment for women on campus. I couldn't waste the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about what I do every day here on campus with my fabulous team that's sitting to the right of all of you, and that any folks on the live stream cannot see. So what is the Flora Stone Mather Center for Women? Well, it is a community space and a social innovator empowering women and advancing gender equity through research-informed action. We've got a fabulous team that focuses on programs, policies, and projects and services related to a breadth of areas such as leadership development for students, faculty, and staff, career coaching, professional mentoring, women in politics, gender equity in STEM, women's entrepreneurship, women's history, masculinities, women of color initiatives, community partnerships, research grants, health education, and violence prevention and response. Most women's centers do one or two of these things, and for the last 19 years, the Mather Center has evolved to do them all, which makes us one of the largest and the most comprehensive women's centers in the country. Thereby, right, I think this uniquely positions the Mather Center to be a leader for women and gender equity centers nationwide in higher education. Our approach to leadership was to launch a women's interdisciplinary learning lab in 2020 to do this, right? So a learning lab approach to knowledge creation is inherently interdisciplinary, applying a family of approaches through an action research methodology, drawing in the fields of education, psychology, sociology, organizational studies. This action research learning lab brings together new knowledge and practical change, focusing on research for practical application to solve problems. It's uniquely situated to employ this approach to improve practice. And so why do I share some of this? Well, this is how this project came to be today, right? So though it might be in some ways my research project and in line with my research agenda, it's also in line with the vision and gender of the Mather Center and the WELL. Right, so we call this the Women's Center Educational Learning Lab, or the WELL. Our aim is supporting, sharing, and producing knowledge for and by women and gender centers in higher education. The well of knowledge is a known expression that refers to the endless or never-ending source of knowledge, or the term the well used to indicate this unfathomable something that is so deep that we cannot reach the bottom of it. Right, you're probably familiar with the original Greek term for this. Folks have heard of the well of knowledge, right? Yeah. So the spring of Macedonia, right, was believed to be the fountain of knowledge, and whoever drinks from it will be inspired. Margaret Atwood had a much darker take on the well. In her 2009 novel about two women surviving a pandemic, which when we came up with the name, we were not necessarily thinking this might actually happen, but was inspired to call the well something that you were sucked into, this well of knowledge that you can only plummet, learning more and more, but not getting any happier. I am inspired by the well as interpreted by Patricia Hill Collins as a contribution to the overall well of knowledge that we as humans have access to. Collins argues that patriarchal power relations have historically dominated the well, shutting out women and other subordinate groups' contributions. Feminist theories allow women and other subordinated groups to lay claim to their experiences and the accompanying knowledge, and to add them to the common well. For Collins, this was, quote, an interpretive framework dedicated to explicating, I lost my place, how knowledge remains central to maintaining and changing unjust systems of power. Thus, feminist theory, right, can help us interrogate these lived experiences and make them usable knowledge for all. This is the work of the WELL as we seek to advance gender equity in higher education. Ooh, I'm behind. Okay. Does it make sense now? So how do I come to this work? Right, well, I'm a white queer cis woman, a mom, and was a Pell Grant-funded college student. I grew up in a one-bedroom household with my mom above my grandparents. My mom graduated college the same year I graduated high school from an adult ed program. I began my career in higher education as a department secretary and ended up being a faculty member and now the executive director of the Center for Women. That department secretary job is still the second best job I've ever had in higher education. We can unpack that in another time, this being the first. I have, as Rob said, 15 years experience in the field, and though some of that has been at faculty, right, most of that has been either as a staff member or serving staff, helping them to develop as professionals, and particularly coaching women staff. So this study is shaped in part by these experiences of giving professional development to other women staff. I'm driven by a commitment to higher education for a public good, and my personal scholarship seeks to examine how intersecting social identities advance, right, or limit educational and professional opportunities. And I hope that it will illuminate ways that we can move forward and make education less inequitable. So this is kind of a pivot. So because of this situated action research, this professional experience, it's really important for me to give you a quick little overview about HIRE, which is a conference for ambitious women in higher education. So HIRE is a program that pushes women forward in their career development and helps them pull other women up along the way. It was started by Wiser, which is now owned by EAB, EdTech National Corporation, and we partner with them to deliver a curriculum to women nationwide in higher education, both faculty and staff. And this study is really taken from the experiences working with those staff. So what does this mean, right? So staff are the largest group of workers in higher education. They are also predominantly women and disproportionately people of color. Staff lack the professional autonomy and academic freedom of students and faculty, and many do not understand the organizational purpose of higher education, coming into higher education from many different fields, and so therefore sometimes not seeing their role in the larger organization. In attempting to address this problem, that I discovered that there was a gap in the research supporting staff, and particularly women staff in higher education. So if you look at this pathway, right, I was delivering professional development within my current role, began to do it nationwide through the HIRE program. Participants shared these unique experiences. We went to go adapt the curriculum to address them and found no research to do that, right? So we designed a survey ourselves. We are in the preliminary analysis of that data, and the idea is to share the results, right, in traditional academic ways, but also to redevelop the curriculum to better suit women's staff in higher education and their needs, thereby generating new questions so we can collect additional information to continuously redevelop the curriculum to better support those needs. Right, so we're trying to create a chain of evidence for the significance of staff in the field of higher education and the importance for attention onto them and organizational change to support them. So what literature there is, right, on the organization of higher education reminds us that colleges and universities serve many roles. We teach students, we create and disseminate new research and knowledge, we serve as cultural hubs, we contribute to regional economic development, we do public service, we do outreach, right? We also serve a critical role as employers in the region and nationwide. Modern organizational theory that many of our corporate partners use, right, that you might use if you're doing leadership or community engagement or any really type of community or work with others relationally in your area, were developed studying higher education. We're developed studying senior leadership and faculty in higher education. Right? So I think it's important for us to realize how little attention has really been paid to non-instructional staff. So due to the important nature of staff roles in academic advising, student services, management, maintenance, knowledge dissemination, and more, the relative growth to faculty positions, with now the higher education workforce being 60% staff, not non-instructional staff, so non-faculty positions. We need to better understand the experiences of non-instructional staff as a crucial segment of the academic workforce. In addition, another often overlooked aspect of non-instructional staff is the occupational diversity in higher education employees, from librarians to managers, construction workers. Keyser et al. Calls for, quote, more studies of campus staff to explore the ways their jobs are being transformed and to better understand their impact on college missions and operations. Furthermore, I believe that research in higher education that neglects non-instructional staff neglects the largest group of employees in higher education who are, again, predominantly women at 60% and disproportionately women of color at 31%. The demographic shift this demographic shift in higher education is often referred to as the feminization of higher education or the feminization of labor. Has anybody heard of this before? So we see this also with our students, right? So students, maybe not here at Case, but at Western Reserve, but nationwide are predominantly women as well. So the feminization of higher education workforce becomes increasingly relevant when we take into account a Pew Research Center study or polling finding that there has been a growing distrust, devaluing, and shrinking of prestige of higher education within the general public. This phenomenon can be understood as a gender dimension of labor through the rubric of the feminization of labor. The feminization of education, at its simplest understanding, is what I just talked about a second ago, right? That it's becoming increasingly women entering higher education. But when we see this at the workforce level, it can also be seen as a structural transformation, devaluing the work and a loss of prestige for those who work in higher education. The feminization of higher education is an extension of the neoliberal context that results in a growing similarity of working conditions for faculty, postdocs, graduate students, and staff of all gender identities, wherein we have lower wages, fewer benefits, less agency and opportunity for advancement, as well as a heightened anxiety over job security. This is particularly true for non-instructional staff workers, especially support staff, who now serve larger numbers of students and employees than ever before. So this led us to have a few research questions, right? So we took a critical constructivist approach to examining higher education through the feminization of labor lens, thinking about the lack of research in non-instructional staff, who are, again, predominantly women-aligned and disproportionately women of color. We were prompted to ask, what are the educational and career experiences of women-aligned non-instructional staff in higher education? What relationships are present between imposter syndrome, campus climate, career satisfaction, career decision-making for women-aligned non-instructional staff? And what factors contribute to women staff seeking to leave higher education? Right, so as I mentioned before, research is guided by, as I mentioned before, we looked at many of the common areas, right, that are studied for women senior executives in and outside of higher education and for faculty. And this is a quite extensive list of them. Our research questions drove the methodology for this, and really, we're trying to identify how we might get to answer these questions. It became increasingly clear to us that we needed to go back to the population, right, that inspired them. So I was particularly attuned to wanting to have a breadth of staff. Not all staff have professional organizations, right? How many staff here are involved with a professional organization that's staff-facing, right? I'm assuming a lot of them might be academic affairs, right? Student services, student affairs, yep. And so I really wanted to make sure we also had department administrators, folks from advancement, right? If we could, folks from maintenance and construction, the library, career counseling, right? A lot of different areas. And so that was one of the things that was really important to me, as well as having it be for women-aligned staff broadly, so anybody that identified as women or femme. So who are the actual population of women-aligned staff, right? So as I mentioned before, right, the population of women-aligned staff makes up 60% of the population of staff. 31% of that 60% are women of color, and it's just over 1 million nationwide. And so our sample was taken from the group of women who participated in hire. So about 6,000 women nationwide participated in hire. So we solicited them, but we tried to get them involved through snowball sampling, having been part of our professional development. We also used social media with some of the groups that we had connected with and some of the informal professional organizations for women in those other groups I talked about. So there were 102 respondents in the findings I'm going to talk about today. So they're preliminary and they're emerging. Our goal is to have about 300 respondents, and we are quickly approaching that right now. All right, so are you ready to see this data? All right, I promise it's not as painful as it looks. There will be a lot of graphs and charts. I tried to make it as visually appealing as possible. I've got lots of fun stats for you. I'm doing great on time. So 100 of these women identified as cisgender women, 2 as non-binary women-aligned non-instructional staff across 33 states. Ages ranged from 24 to 62, with 44% of respondents being between 24 and 34 years of age, 32% between 35 and 44 years of age, and 14% between 45 and 54 years of age, and 10% being between 55 and 62 years of age. 4% of the respondents were working at a community or junior college, 4% at technical institutions, 18% at small liberal arts colleges, 37% at comprehensive institutions, 13% at high research institutions, 24% at very high research institutions. 2% of respondents also reported working at HBCUs, 3% at women's colleges, 6% at Hispanic-serving institutions, and 2% at minority-serving institutions. There were no ANAPESEs represented. 28% were in academic affairs, including the library. 26% were in student affairs, including health and counseling. We let folks self-identify their areas. So that's what makes it, I think, additionally interesting. 10% were in business and operations, including marketing, human resources, and general counsel's office. 8% in career services, 7% in enrollment management, 7% in advancement and alumni relations, 7% in housing and residence life. One of my favorite parts was they identified themselves as uniquely not student affairs for another presentation. 7% in diversity, equity, and inclusion. 8% of the sample were working in senior leadership positions, 32% in director or management level positions, 54% in professional positions, so think other non-support roles, most likely no direct reports, 3% support staff, and 3% declined to answer. 12% of them these women held bachelor's degrees, 68% had master's degrees, and 18% had terminal degrees. Only 1% had no college level degree. So 75% of the sample was white, non-Hispanic, 11% Black or African American women, 3% Asian, 5% multiracial, 5% Hispanic or Latinx, and 1% Native American. After looking at the demographics of the sample, I looked at the relationships between key demographics and scales or concepts in the survey I've talked about thus far. Race had a significant relationship with both career satisfaction and role models. Women of color had higher than expected reports for strongly disagreeing with career satisfaction and reported less role models than expected. Existing research supports that women of color reported less role models when staff and faculty at most institutions are predominantly white. As I continue to analyze the data, this is something I want to explore further. When we think about sexual orientation, 3% of the respondents identified as questioning, 4% as asexual, 2% as lesbian, and 19% as queer, bisexual, or pansexual, leaving 72% identifying as heterosexual. Sexual orientation has a significant relationship with income, caregiving, using an employee assistance program, and experiencing personal trauma. Across all LGBTQ plus identities, there were higher than expected reports for making under $48,000 a year. There were also fewer than expected reports of household income. LGBTQ individuals had larger than expected reports of being caregivers, as well as using the EAP program and experiencing personal trauma. So existing research here also supports, right, that LGBTQ individuals, I'm skipping the T because there were no trans individuals besides the two non-binary folks in the study, which was not a large enough portion to look at. Research suggests that these groups already experience higher levels of trauma. As you will see when I get to the employee assistance programs and personal trauma, they play a large role in relationships related to other models in the study, including income and considering leaving higher education. I'm also not surprised that women identified queer folks are also more likely to have children. As we know, the largest portion of queer folks, right, have multiple types of partners in their life, so it's not uncommon, I think, for them to have children, which I hope today is something more in the consciousness of everyone, so if that seemed strange, it's not particularly novel. Income. Salaries ranged up to $200,000, with 90% of the respondents making less than $100,000 and 49% of household incomes being less than $100,000. Income and household income had a significant relationship with personal trauma. Participants making less than $80,000 a year, with the highest difference under $48,000 a year, had higher than expected reports of experiencing personal trauma. The less money you made, the more reports of personal trauma. For household income under $100,000, personal trauma was also reported more than expected. Existing research, right, supports that access to resources significantly impacts trauma experiences. Women living in poverty experience extremely high rates of mental illness, particularly depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress disorder, relative to the general population. Though you will see that income also has a significant relationship with career satisfaction and considering leaving higher education, this result raises concerns about poverty and a living wage for women staff in higher education in general. Caregivers. I found this particularly fascinating, and I'm interested to see if it will shift as we analyze the whole sample. 49% of folks in the survey identified as caregivers of both children under 18 as well as older family members. 55% were married, 16% partnered, 29% single, divorced, or widowed. There was a relationship between caregivers and age, years in the field, and being promoted. A positive relationship. So there were more than expected counts of this. And so I thought this was really particularly interesting as it goes against a lot of the research about caregivers. And I don't think that it should underscore what we know about the way caregivers can be treated in the workforce. And particularly when we think about work-life balance concerns, right, support for caregivers in higher education, that has been consistently documented in the research. Still with me? Okay. Oh, now I'm jumping ahead too far. So I want to explain this visual before I sort of tell you the statistics about it. This is not out of 100%. If anybody is good at math, you will immediately realize that this is a hierarchical graph. So it's actually asking 4 questions, and it's showing you what proportions, right? So it's just trying to give you a visual of each question, how large the yes response was, right? So, yes, okay. 75% of the participants reported being promoted, right? 44% making a lateral move, 5% being fired, and 3% being demoted. As you have seen and will see in additional analyses, promotion had a significant relationship with caregivers, but not any others in the study. There was also no significant relationship with being demoted, fired, or making a lateral move. So it really had no relationship to any of the other variables. So similar type of graph looking at whether folks had participated in professional development, role models, had mentors, or part of networks, or had sponsors. And if you've already seen, role models had a significant relationship with race, but not any others in the study. I think one interesting thing to report is that the sample was too low, but a lot of folks that talked about not having career satisfaction had to either pay for their own professional development or do it on their own time. And if anyone's been watching sort of the news coming out about the Great Resignation, which I will talk about in a little bit, professional development is something that has been cited again and again as something that makes employees particularly feel positive about their career and work in general. Okay, so imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is defined as a persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts or skills. Loosely, it's defined as doubting your abilities and feeling like a fraud. Always when I say the word fraud when I'm presenting this research, it's always a faint like, right? Because like everybody's like, me, I sometimes feel like a fraud. There was a relationship between using the Employee Assistance Program as well as age in feelings of imposter syndrome, right? They were higher than expected and intense and frequent for those at a younger age and those who had used the Employee Assistance Program, compared with those who hadn't or were older, right? But I don't feel like that really tells the story here, right? I'm assuming everyone can see the underlined in all caps, right? I think the big takeaway, the most profound response to the survey was that all women scored at some level on the scale of having imposter syndrome. So this was a scale that could be scored like does not have, right, has few feelings, moderate feelings, frequent feelings, intense feelings. And so only 4% of the respondents had few imposter feelings, 35% moderate, 51% frequent, and 10% intense. And so though the scores decreased over age, they never went away. I think it's really important to continue to look at this variable because we use imposter syndrome as a professional development tool often for women. We talk about if we say it and if we expose it, right, that we will all of a sudden be relieved of it in some way. But I think the constant focus on imposter syndrome when it's ever present is actually a deterrent from structural change, right? We need to see actual changes in the system, not continually working on women. It's going to have no significant impact. Okay, so we also looked at campus climate, right? We used the HERE survey, which may not be familiar with for everyone, but it's like when we do a faculty or student climate survey, it's often done from UCLA, from the Higher Education Research Institute. Looking at my higher education folks, I think that is what the acronym stands for. Mayhew in 2006 redeveloped, made some slight changes to it have it be given to staff. And so it really has not been shown up in the literature since being given to staff. And so we decided to include it in the study and give it to staff. Included items on supervision, coworker identities, university administration's commitment to campus climate, negative and positive comments and representation of marginalized populations, and obstacles to achieving diversity. All participants strongly disagreed that institutional efforts and administration were committed to supporting a positive campus climate. There were no agree or strongly agree. One particularly interesting result was hearing negative comments had no relationship with other variables in the survey, but hearing positive comments or seeing positive representations of marginalized groups had a statistically significant relationship with campus climate overall. It is not lost on me that giving this presentation might possibly fall under the negative category, but I do think it is really important to pause here and say that this is consistent with some of the qualitative literature and individual experiences where folks have said, like, I just want to see more visibility, more representation that is positive, right? Not just tolerance, not just a lack of bad things happening, but that there also needs to be some positive experiences as well. Okay. So career satisfaction and career decision making. Career satisfaction is defined as the levels of contentment with one's current position and progression of learned skills, income, and promotion. Career decision-making self-efficacy is defined as an individual's belief that they have the ability to complete successfully the tasks related to decision-making in relationship to their careers. As expected, right, there was a range of levels of career satisfaction and decision-making self-efficacy scores, with decision-making leaning more heavily towards agree and no reports of strongly disagree. Career satisfaction, in addition to being statistically significant in their relationship with race, as previously mentioned, there was also a relationship with personal trauma and considering leaving higher education. I think it's important to note that these are looking at the broader scales, but when you drill down on some particularly key questions, it's a very different picture. So for instance, with career decision making, it asks, when you are under stress at work, do you think that you can make sound career decisions? And the answer was way higher than expected reports of no, right? As opposed to the decision making scale overall, which asks things like, are you able to get a degree, like to advance your career, right? Do you know how to apply for a job, right? So it's really looking at some of those key aspects that tell a broader story. Okay. So getting closer to what I think are some of the most important findings. When we look at personal trauma and using the Employee Assistance Program, we definitely saw some really interesting results. So personal trauma is defined as a range of events that overwhelm an individual's coping capacities or has involved threats of serious injury or death to someone, yourself or to someone close to you. The Employee Assistance Program, I hope all of you know about it, offers individual or group short-term counseling to employees with work or personal related problems. In this study, individuals were asked if they had utilized EAP for workplace issues and if they had experienced personal trauma affecting their work. There was a significant relationship between personal trauma and both career decision-making and career satisfaction. All participants that answered disagree have the ability to complete successfully the tasks related to decision-making of their career had experienced the personal trauma, every single one. Those who experienced personal trauma had more reports that they were not satisfied with their career. Those without experiences of personal trauma reported higher than expected career satisfaction. There were higher than reported expected reports of using EAP, Employee Assistance Program, for those who reported frequent or intense feelings of imposter syndrome, as well as higher than expected reports of using the Employee Assistance Program. Qualitative follow-up questions were asked for folks to elaborate on why they might have used EAP, and there were 42 responses. Common themes included work-related stress, demeaning relationships with supervisors, communication issues, sexual misconduct, including campus sexual assault or harassment by a supervisor or a student. So staff reported being sexually assaulted or harassed by their supervisor or a student, and continuing to work to stay working as staff at that institution. There are also many reports of secondary trauma, defined as an acute type of stress or burnout resulting from helping or wanting to help a person suffering from trauma. Respondents who reported experiencing personal trauma provided 63 additional qualitative responses. Perhaps due to the wording of the question, a lot of the experiences they talked about were actually with work. So the question was worded, experience personal trauma had an effect on your work. And so that may have been that, but it also may be that folks believe that their personal traumas are their work traumas are not the workplace's responsibility, but their own responsibility, and internalizing them personally, which is something I would like to explore further. Most experiences were related to secondary trauma, a relationship with the supervisor, but also, where's the list of a couple? A few folks also pointed out that they felt like there was sexism or racism operating in the workplace, and I thought that was particularly important because it did not show up in the campus climate survey in the same way. Regardless, these results signal that mental health of staff is at risk and should be a major concern of higher education institutions as employers. We often think of mental health support as important for students, right? But we must expand our thinking to include staff and faculty as well. Okay, so especially since personal trauma and using the Employee Assistance Program had statistically significant relationships with considering leaving higher education, I thought it was important to tell you that 78% of folks were considering leaving higher education, or 80 of the 102. And we asked seriously, like, are you serious? Are you looking? Are you considering leaving? Let's see, expected reports were higher for those that used EAP and personal trauma. Yes, I said this. Okay. In addition, there was a relationship between considering leaving higher education and both career satisfaction and income, which I feel like makes a lot of sense. Respondents who were considering leaving higher education were invited to share more about why they were considering leaving. Salary was cited most often, followed by lack of opportunities for promotion, large workload, not feeling valued, being disillusioned with the work, and secondary trauma. A few additional responses for considering leaving, as I mentioned before, were noted no remote work options, sexism, stress, and racism. And one particular person reported that they had just accepted a job with an ed tech company that day, which I thought was really, really fun, with multiple exclamation points. Which, it's both funny and hard for me as someone who loves working in higher education. Okay. Ooh, that got so much brighter. I could see it behind me. So I'm going to let you look at this for a second and give myself an opportunity to drink a sip of water. $4.3 million people quit or changed a job in December 2020. Then the nation's quit rate reached a 20-year high in November 2021. This phenomenon has been deemed the Great Resignation. Recent articles in Inside Higher Education and the Chronicle point to a growing conversation about this phenomenon coming to colleges and universities nationwide if it isn't already here. This one, right now, your best employees are eyeing the exits, is a particularly amazing article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, or op-ed. I suggest you all read it. If you're on campus or you're signed in with your VPN, it should be free. A new Pew Research Center survey released on March 9th, 2022, found that low pay, a lack of opportunity for advancement, and feeling disrespected at work were top reasons why Americans are quitting the job. The survey also found that those who quit and are now employed elsewhere are more likely than not to say their current job offers better pay, more opportunities for advancement, and more work-life balance and flexibility. The findings from the Pew Center have some obvious overlaps with this study, right, in issues and raises concerns causing employee turnover. But the unique context of higher education and personal and workplace trauma issues raised in these preliminary results, I think, point to a need for additional research on women staff in higher education in general. So before closing and some additional implications, because I chose to talk about some of the research here today, I also must note that this study, like all studies, has limitations. This is no exception. The current sample is preliminary, right, is not representative because we use snowball sampling. Participant self-selection may be a factor. Many of these respondents come from leadership programs, right, or online professional networks. And then we were in COVID, right? That was not the initial intent, and we can never really take it out of that context. Okay, but more importantly, what are some implications for research and practice? So I think this study adds to a small but hopefully growing body of literature on staff in higher education, giving insights for staff retention amongst the Great Resignation, including increasing salaries, flexible work, providing mentors and role models, as well as professional development. Staff need more autonomy and respect for their individual expertise. We are the most educated staff in any industry. Also, increased professional development for supervisors is needed. Supervisors who are women too, right? Supervision is hard, and I think we should spend more time on that professional development based on many of the things said in the survey. The level of reported workplace personal trauma demonstrates a strong need for continued support for employee assistance programs and additional support for secondary trauma experienced by colleges and university professionals. Additional research is needed on staff and mental health and the impact of the living wage on this relationship in the higher education workforce. I also think implications from this study include investigating what I'm calling an unexplored campus climate issue for staff, which is sort of a hostile work environment for women, people of color, LGBTQ individuals, and low-income workers that is much more about how we are treating that workplace. It's much more about that autonomy and the lack of support for experiences of staff that mirror students. Finally, increasing understanding for sexual misconduct, sexism, homophobia, ableism, racism, and their effect on employee experiences with campus climate, with a particular focus on how positive representations, as we spoke about, may be preferred way of increasing the perception of supportive campus climate, in addition to the effect on their mental health and well-being. So what are some next steps? I love a concept map. If you know me, you know I love a concept map. I'm sorry in advance if I've made you make a concept map with me in a meeting. But this is a visual of the primary and secondary relationships in the data that was represented. So based on the current workforce phenomena and preliminary results, right, my next steps will be to analyze the complete data set for predictive factors in climate, workplace, personal trauma, and considering leaving higher education. And, I should have pointed out earlier, but I do want to point out now, we went a little bit out of our way to not specifically solicit staff from Case Western Reserve University, thinking about how we were situated here and could oversample. But if you are in our newsletter, you might see that we did talk about the study in our newsletter. So the final sample may include a few folks, but this is really speaking to a nationwide issue. Well, thank you all so much for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'll take comments too. I don't know. Do we have any way of knowing if anybody asked a question on the live stream? That's okay. I just learned yesterday that was a thing, so.
Well, if you have any questions, you can come up to one of the mics. Go over here. I'm kind of like the middle.
Hi.
First of all, thank you for your talk, Angela. It was really, really interesting. What I'm wondering about is, as you think about staff in a place where we have a really differential treatment of some groups of people, like faculty, versus people who are in staff roles, have you thought about how, as comparative people we are, right, how it can make it even more problematic for staff when they're treated so very differently from other people who work for the same institution?
Yeah, absolutely. I think about two things about this often. One is I think actually a part of diversity, equity, inclusion program on campuses should be a little bit about the hierarchy and roles on campus, right, and educating faculty. And I feel okay saying this, having been a faculty member, that like some education, right, on what other folks do and what behaviors might be disrespectful, right, or devaluing would be really important. The other thing is, I think the way higher education is structured, we really need to think about it. We say we're this professional bureaucracy. I already feel super nerdy now that I'm talking about bureaucracies, but again, my staff know I also love to do this. or my team. Professional bureaucracies are the idea that everybody is sort of an expert. We develop these expertise, right? And we've employed this with faculty and senior leaders, right? Or maybe center directors. But we don't think about that the same way sometimes with like department administrators or folks in the registrar, but they have also developed a set of expertise that may be different, but also needs some respect. But we actually think of them as workers. And we employ more of what we call mechanical bureaucracy. Like you work 8 to 5, you do these tasks, right? But I have yet to see a task in higher education that doesn't include some type of expertise, but we don't treat it that way. So there are these two sort of clashing organizational cultures, this mechanical bureaucracy and this professional bureaucracy. And so the institution also needs to acknowledge that we need to be all treated as professionals. Hi.
Thank you so much. This was very, very informative. My name is Maya Fenty. I'm actually new to the institution, a navigator.
Oh, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. So I had a couple questions, actually. I was curious about this concept you presented on feminization in higher education. And you quoted some research that were dated in 90s, 91. So I was just wondering, how far did you trace that concept? And how did it change? It has been, almost 20 years now,
Yeah.
since the early 90s. So is it the same thing, or is it, how does it change since the early 90s? And my second kind of follow-up to that is this, when you say feminization in higher education, is it in relation to women leaders overall? Because, as you know, the literature is a little bit different. Women leaders are not as much as men. In the higher you go, the women's numbers go lower,
Yeah.
And this third question, I'll just go ahead and ask. So you mentioned the framework, critical constructivist framework. How did that play into your analysis in the end? So
I love these questions. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Thank you for asking me about the theories. They make me very happy. I really believe that, theories are based on people's lived experiences. That's how we begin to theorize. So they're really not so separated, right, from everyone's experience, whether or not you're a researcher or not. So, oh God, I hope I remember all the questions. Please hang around so you can remind me. So I'm going to start with the feminization of labor one. And so the reason I chose to focus on scholars who had talked about it in the 80s and 90s is because they were the ones who were theorizing what the feminization of labor meant, as opposed to focusing on studies that use that framework. So there's been a lot of studies that have used that framework, but not on higher education. They've used it in other fields. So for instance, teachers, nursing, right, are fields that were predominantly men historically, and they looked at data over the course of 200 years to look at how, as those fields became, those positions had been held more by women, that the salaries went down and the prestige went down for them. And so what the feminization of labor applied to higher education does is it points to that now that that more women are in more staff roles, predominantly all the staff roles, right? But you're right, not senior leadership, and are growing in the faculty and are primarily students. Prestige is being lost for everyone who works in higher education, including men, non-binary, trans folks, right, as well as women, because the prestige and pay and autonomy in higher education are changing because more women are entering the field. And then critical constructivism, I really like. So constructivism is just the idea that, right, that we are interactors, right, with each other in the world, and we socially create things through our experiences together, through experiencing things like Case Western Reserve or at your church, right? But when you take a critical lens, it's that when you expose those things, they have to be transformative as well. And so that's really how that came for me, like that we couldn't just do this survey. We also then had to use it to help the women who had helped us get this information to improve their professional development. What did I miss? Did I miss anything?
I think you answered all of them. Thank you so much. So you mentioned the transformative aspect for the interviewers, for the researchers, correct? So how did you approach the objectivity versus subjectivity in this work?
So as a feminist, I believe that really nothing is objective, that we just need to make our sort of bias, right, as visible as possible. So that's why I talked a little bit about my experience in higher education, working with the program. And it's not perfect, right? There's always more that can be done, but that's really how I tried to balance that out, because I'm both an outsider and an insider in the study, because I'm also a staff member, right? So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question was about the group that was sampled, and I think that I heard that highly educated or had the opportunity for higher education, and that, was it from a conference group?
A series of conferences across the nation for 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So many people that are staff never have the opportunity to go to a conference.
Yeah.
And more I've noticed in higher education that a college degree is required for most kinds of positions, even when it may not be necessary in any kind of way. So I was curious about opportunities to involve more responses from individuals who won't be at a conference and may not fit like that profile.
Yeah, absolutely. So 2 things, well, 3 things. 1, 100%. Also good to see you. I should say 4 things, right? But one of the reasons we chose the higher conference is that they particularly targeted folks that didn't really get to travel. So they traveled to all these different states over 3 years, and then we picked up this last year and have been traveling. And so they were able to tap into people who had never received professional development before. And so that's why I thought it was one of the best areas to sample. And then we asked them to send it to their colleagues on their campuses and nationwide that might not have gone. So everybody had to be a current staff member, and there were 2 or 3 people who did not have any degree in the sample. In the larger sample, because I've been looking at it, I feel like we've done a pretty decent job. I'm kind of excited because there are a few more folks that don't have a college degree who are working sort of in support roles, and we found a nice sort of cohort of folks who just had an associate's degree. Which I also think is an interesting area. So we specifically kind of pushed in this way to see that. I always hope that folks send it. When they send it out, they like read what we asked to and they send it, but it's hard to know. We've been talking a lot about going to places where there was a high population of folks who responded that might be like ripe for like a focus group or some interviews, and then maybe being able to get to talk to different women on campus. Yeah. Hi, Andrea.
Hi, Angela. Is this one on? I can pop over to the other side. I can project if that's okay too. So I had a question. So I was interested in your finding that all the participants of the study had imposter syndrome, and your analysis, that critical approach to say like, there's an assumption if we make this transparent and we all talk about it, then the problem will resolve itself, and that's such a thing that I think is unique to centering the problem back on the population, right? It's our problem to solve as women to address this imposter syndrome. So thinking about how you first came to this study, looking for research to inform your practice, and the goal is to go back and use this research to do that, how might you change the professional development that you're offering for women staff members or the people in positions of power who can make those decisions and make those changes in order to create a more equitable environment?
It's such a great question. So there's this thing I already love in the higher programming that I think we really want to dig into more and expand, which is this push-pull, we call it, right? So we're not talking about imposter syndrome. We start from an asset-based model, looking at the things that folks have accomplished in their career and how they might use that as a catalyst to do the other types of things that they want to do in their career. And we talk with folks a lot about making that planning, right? So pushing themselves up. But then the second part is we give folks time to strategize about pulling other folks up. So now you have some student workers, right? Or you have a GA, right? Or you've moved up into a role where you have some budget autonomy, like all these different things. You're on this committee, right? Or now you have supervisees as you've moved up into the senior role. What are you going to do to change the environment behind you? But I think that's only part of it, right? It's also, again, putting all the onus on women, particularly in this, right? So I do think that getting the research out there, right, is actually it's a more traditional thing to do than the other stuff we're doing, but those are the things that senior leaders read. Yeah. Yeah, I'm hoping that we will just realize that it's a structural problem, right? That just having a more positive environment, a more supportive environment that is explicit. I'm going to try and stop it. I'm going to want to talk more about it. Any other questions? Well, if you think of any others, oh no, I did not put it up here. I'm going to say it really slow. And then also for anyone on the live stream, if you want to send in any questions, my email is AXC, 90, hold on. I said that and then I was like, nope, don't know it. AXC954, AXC954 at case.edu, or you can also message Mather Center at case.edu. Thanks so much, everybody.